Hello and welcome to the big conversation in West Mercia. My name is John Campion and I'm the West Mercia Police and Crime Commissioner, and I'll let my guests introduce themselves.
Hi there, my name's Alex Murray and I'm the Temporary Chief Constable.
Hello, my name is Richard Cooper. I'm the Temporary Deputy Chief Constable.
Hello, my name's Claire Richardson. I am the Head of Policy and Commissioning.
So why are we here today? Why are we taking part in this session? So we're very used to formal meetings where I hold the Chief Constable to account for the performance of West Mercia Police delivering services to our community. This very much isn't that. It's an opportunity to help ensure that the voice of the public is heard as I develop my next police and crime plan for West Mercia that will help support not only operational policing over the next 4 years, but most importantly, tackling the issues that our communities care about. As the voice of the public in policing, I want to make sure that the voice of our communities are heard loud and clear, and I'm incredibly grateful for the 140 of you who got involved in the preparation for this session, and I'll be talking with Alex, Richard and Claire around some of those issues, and we'll be discussing the potential areas that can maybe be developed. Some of the areas are a bit harder to progress, and ultimately help us give the foundations for what will be in the police and crime plan that I will publish for consultation over the summer. We will be covering a range of themes, and West Mercia as a community is enormous, and the range of issues that affect them are equally as enormous. And so we have tried to focus them into sections and themes. But if our people are interested in certain areas rather than others, there will be timestamps around those themes. So please do go to the section that interests you. As per the range of issues that we have, some things might not feature in today's conversation. It doesn't mean that they're not important, and sometimes we might not be able to give lots of airtime to all of the subjects. But for us, the views of the public are the important part, and that's what we will be discussing today. So the first section is around visibility and accessibility. Fair to say, the biggest response that I get, not only during my usual work as Commissioner out in the community, but also during the PCC elections, was about visibility and the accessibility of police officers in our communities. We talk a lot about record numbers of police officers, some 2,500 of them. I have tended not to try and focus on police officers because 2,500 police officers sounds a lot, but also doesn't sound very many, doesn't it? And I know it's the most we've ever had, but if people don't feel the benefit, then the number becomes irrelevant, doesn't it? And part of one of the things I wanted to touch on, Alex, was around a resident in Evesham said that there isn't a local Bobby on the beat, anyone to talk to or raise local concerns around, either report it 101 or online. And I suppose I just wanted to chat through a little bit about your view as Chief as to how in the modern world of 2024 we support policing to be visible and accessible in our communities.
Thanks. Well, it's a really interesting and good point. And policing and society has changed massively over the last 20 years. And you can see that from the Crime Survey of England and Wales, where both in West Mercia and elsewhere, crime on the streets has gone down. But they still have antisocial behaviour and we still have crime, whereas online and in the house, in the private dwelling, crime has gone up. So things like computer misuse, hacking, fraud, domestic abuse, and how we police those has changed as well. So, back when Richard and I were young officers, we were much less concerned about risk. We dealt with what's in front of us. Now we think about, okay, how do I prevent what's just happened in this private dwelling happening again, to protect the children or protect the person who's been subject to violence. So with all those challenges, we need to understand what's the most effective way to police. And indeed, having a Bobby on the beat is hugely valuable for reassurance, as the gentleman said, to ask questions, but also for deterring crime. So if there's antisocial behaviour taking place, if there's drug use taking place, or if there's burglary or theft taking place in the immediate vicinity of that beat officer, it's unlikely to happen. And if it does happen, the officer can do something about it. For that reason, we have neighbourhood teams. So I encourage this Evesham resident to go online to look at their neighbourhood team. They will see the beat officers who are attached to that area and the PCSOs. And we regularly, Commissioner, don't we, have conversations around how we red circle those officers to not always have to respond to calls for service so that they can be as visible as possible. But if we just had officers on foot patrol, those 2,500 officers, our ability to deal with cybercrime, crimes in action, domestic abuse in the home, protecting children would be severely diminished. So it's always a balance, and that's what we continually strive to strike. The final point I'd say is, we want to put the oil where the squeak is, so we put the beat officer where they're most likely to deter crime, but also offer reassurance.
So I think visibility in 2024, exactly that balance between being purposeful and also that reassuring element. How, over the next 4 years, Alex, do you think what are some of the things that we can do or potentially can be doing in terms of operationalizing that intent to be more visible? What are the kind of things you would like to see developed over these next couple of years to improve this as an outcome? Because I agree with you, visibility now is as much online as it is feeling safe online as it is in our public spaces.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things we aspire to do. And when you think about visibility, where do people gather the most, where they see officers the most? And it's actually where there's also the greatest need from a crime point of view. And so we think about town centres. We might talk about that in a minute. But if we can have officers in town centres at peak time, both offering a reassurance, but also offering a deterrence. And then in the online space, recently, and we are massively embracing Facebook as a medium through engaging with communities. Yes, there's some presence on Snap and a bit on X, but we know most communities use Facebook, and there can be that interaction. So working with our comms team, we're working particularly hard in that area. And then some of the advice we can give in relation to online crime is also through that medium as well.
So we've talked a bit about visibility, and over the next 4 years, do you think it is possible, from what we know now, and I know things might change, who predicted the pandemic type thing, but do you think with the way the organisation is heading and with my political priority that visibility will increase, do you think there are steps that we can now take to increase visibility?
Yes, I do. And Rich, come in wherever you need. But one of the things I really want to do, because I've got officers out and police staff out, let's not forget police community support officers, our police staff colleagues who are the most visible in the organisation. They're out, they might walk down someone's street and you might not see them, but they've been on the street. And so we need to do something to say, how does that street know that I've been here? How do we advertise it on Facebook? How do we put leaflets out? And how do we amplify the message of our presence, which has a reassuring message, but also a deterrent message? So I think it is possible to influence people's perceptions of how visible policing has been.
So one of the things we've just touched on was around officers being embedded into their communities, and what that means in 2024 is up for debate, isn't it, in terms of how you are in communities. Over these next 4 years, just talk a little bit around what are the possibilities around how that sense of them being embedded in that community could manifest itself. The political language is, putting policing back at the heart of the community or working with the community. How do you think it's likely to manifest itself, and how the expectation of the perhaps untrue, history of police officers on every corner, clipping urchins around the ear rolls, because that's never going to be the case, and I don't think it probably ever was the case. But how does that, do you think, will manifest itself, or could manifest itself?
Yeah, the stories of the Dixon of Doc Green era are always quite interesting, aren't they? And society has changed considerably, and policing, I think, has improved considerably since the 60s. Certainly, I speak to some of my colleagues who worked in the 60s, and they would talk about different standards, different levels of racism, for example. And so we're always making changes there. But the majority of our staff are embedded in communities. When we think about our patrol function, our response function, they're largely brigaded locally in constituencies. And the whole point is they know the territory very well. And when you need the police, you phone up and you get them coming quickly. And the reason why they come quickly is because they are local and they know the roads, and they often know some of the offenders and some of the repeat victims, and they can do a good level of service. But that does necessitate them getting somewhere quick, because when you want the police there quick, you don't want them to be walking, do you? But also, it doesn't give a chance for you to build those long-term, lasting relationships, for example, with a retailer or with neighbourhood watch communities. They're the people who've got the time to sit and have a cup of tea with you. And that's where our beat officers and our PCSOs are hugely important. And we're very keen to ensure they are local, they know the streets, they know the key communities in there, they communicate both physically and on Facebook. And I know certainly yourself, Commissioner, you've got a desire to build that capacity even further over the next 4 years, and how we do that is absolutely key.
We touched a bit on town centres or so far. How? So we've seen, Rich, you as DEP look at the performance of the force, and you manage the crime statistics and look at see where the peaks are. And you will have seen in your time here a big spike in crime in our town centre, as well as a perception in some of our town centres around antisocial and social behaviour. And that's been in some of the feedback that we've had. Toby from Herefordshire, like see more police on the beat during the day or in the high street. Paul in Bromsgrove, our town is growing and crime is increasing. Just talk a little bit about the spike that we've seen in town centre issues and how that might affect the change in policing over the next 3 or 4 years.
So one of the spikes we've seen that affects town centres perhaps more than other areas is around shoplifting. And certainly over the course of last year, shoplifting went up quite sharply during the beginning of the year and then stabilised thereafter, which was a trend noted across the country. And you all have heard, and many viewers will have heard, the concerns amongst retailers regarding a prompt response and ensuring that there's a proper response to shoplifting. We're not seeing that increase continue this year, but we acknowledge that town centres are a place where we can make a really sizable difference in terms of a targeted response. So going back to what Alex has said regarding the next 4 years, town centres mark a location where antisocial behaviour happens, where shoplifting happens, but also where there's a large footfall of people who would benefit and seek reassurance from seeing the police. So over the course of this year, and in fact by the end of September, we will roll out 10 town centre teams. So a combination of police officers, local police officers and PCSOs to patrol the town centres, to be a visible presence, but also to tackle those issues that are very visible to people: retail crime, drug use, antisocial behaviour, criminal damage, that are perhaps more prevalent in town centres, but also more noticeable to the population. So by the end of September, those resources will be in place. We've already got a town centre team operating in Shrewsbury, which has had some success and has been well received by the local population. And so it's reflective of the targeted approach we'd wish to take to people seeing us, people having confidence in us, but at the same time, us putting in place an intelligent response to local problems.
Commissioner, may I come in on the Shropshire point? Because I think it's important for your viewers to understand that beat officers can't do everything. And Shrewsbury in Shropshire is a fine example where we also have serious organised crime unit officers working with beat officers to deal with the drug dealing at a higher level, the kilos of cocaine, for example, that are being dealt with on a street level that causes the antisocial behaviour that the neighbourhood officers often have to respond to. So, albeit you might say a team of detectives working in a proactive unit are not community beat officers or Bobbies on the beat, they have been essential in Shrewsbury for dealing with the antisocial behaviour by removing the drug dealers, the higher networks, and then working with the beat officers to challenge the antisocial behaviour. So there is there's a real natural way that everything is, to a certain extent, community-based. And here we've seen in Shropshire, we've been on a journey with Shrewsbury over the last year where you tackle high-level, serious organised crime, and it affects low-level crime and ASB, and they work in symbiosis.
Because that for me is one of the central points of some of the concerns of our community. Is it's the thing that we can see in terms of we can see the the antisocial behaviour or the perceived to be low-level crime that is actually linked back to that more serious and organised crime. And it's how the wider auspices of policing, and West Mercia Police is contributing towards a town centre being safe, because whilst the spike in retail crime that we've seen or the issues in Shrewsbury that you refer to are a spike, that underlying criminality or harm being caused in the town centres has been there a while and ebbs and flows, and it's how that wider harm is tackled. And that system to do that, I think, really keen to set up. And just touching on Shrewsbury as an example, some of the feedback we've had around street drinking. Street drinking in itself not always linked back to something that can be enforced via policing, often associated with addiction or other forms of medical type issues. How in our town centres to prosper is that partnership element, do you think, and areas that we would want to develop over this next police and crime plan term to help be successful in supporting those town centres? I was out with one of your town centre teams in Shrewsbury a couple of weeks ago. Beautiful Friday afternoon, the sun was shining. With two police officers in. One a male with a custodian, other female officer in police uniform, and the reception from the public really strong, and all the way through from Americans wanting selfies through to the nods of support from those people out and about on their sunny afternoon in Shrewsbury. And I'm just interested how that wider coalition of partners can help in some of the issues that affect the town centres.
Yeah, and it's a cliche, but some things the police can't do on their own, and some of the societal problems associated with addiction are in that space. So yes, we can lock up the dealers, but is policing the right way to deal with street drinkers? And that's where in Shropshire we've worked very closely with the local authority, NGOs, partnership organisations to say, how can we support what you do? How can you discourage city centre drinking, town centre drinking? And there were some locations, for example, in the town centre in Shrewsbury that we know attracted crowds of people that would cause some of the antisocial behaviour problems. So we can come in with some civil interventions or working with the community safety partnership to do that, or we can move the premises to a more ideal location. And there's a number of options we can deal with there.
Claire, you support my office around commissioning and policy development. Some of your work is supporting the drugs partnerships that are out there and wider commissioning in the prevention space. Over the next 4 years, where do you think there's some areas to where either attention or resources can help assist in supporting our town centres to thrive and be the safe spaces I think most of our residents want?
Yes, absolutely. So I think there is definitely some scope for us to develop our partnership work in relation to commissioning. We've had some examples of success fairly recently in terms of safer communities projects, but there is absolutely much more that we can do in that space. For example, taking Shrewsbury again as an area of focus, we have committed to providing funding in partnership with the Town Council and the Shropshire Council for street rangers, quarry marshals, and those sort of non-policing type roles. I'm interested in your feedback around those particular roles and how they contribute towards the policing presence that you mentioned earlier.
I think the evidence is really strong that when you have good town centre teams with partners like marshals, it can be really effective. Criminologists call it a capable guardian, whether that's a uniform officer or someone like a town centre team officer. Business districts often have teams like that, and they're really beneficial. And you can work together. And I also think it's important to stress that when we talk about street drinking, there are some addiction problems, there are some vulnerability problems, but there are some just criminal problems as well that are not acceptable. There's never an excuse sometimes to behave in a particular way. And if you're going to cause harassment, alarm or distress or be aggressive, then whether you're addicted to something or not, it's unacceptable. We should challenge it and the police should challenge it, and we should be robust with those individuals.
Can I just touch on retail crime, just around, I think, a service level expectation, and I think it's an interesting point as to what we might improve over the next 4 years. Michael from Bridgenorth says, my daughter works in Sainsbury's and I'm concerned about the levels of brazen shoplifting, which often comes with threats and menace aimed at staff. This needs tackling. Now, I get this is a private space, essentially, isn't it? A business to where they're responsible for keeping their staff safe, etc., and taking all reasonable measures to stop their goods being stolen. And indeed, they can refuse service, can't they? They don't have to serve, as it were. How do you see that relationship element with some of our retailers about police doing enough to stop the perhaps prolific level of prolific offenders of shoplifting, all the way through to those retail establishments being, target hardened, I think is the technical term. How's that balance between the two, and the level of service that the community, perhaps those retailers, can expect over the next 4 years, and where we might want to see some improvements?
Well, I share Michael's view, and my daughter's worked in retail as well. And firstly, we need to pass on our thanks to everyone who works in retail, and none of them should be subject to that level of abuse. It's unacceptable, and the police should respond, should be locking up the shoplifters, and should be dealing with harassment, alarm, and distress. I think it's fair to say, when we've looked at the shoplifting issues in West Mercia, these are not, as some people say, hungry people stealing nappies. When we've done our research, the people we're arresting are prolific, lifelong criminals. And so it's part of the police's role to be very robust with those individuals to stop it happening. But we never do it in isolation. And again, the evidence is reasonably strong. If you can target harden, we call it situational crime prevention, you can reduce the thefts in a store. And so whether it's putting the relevant security on, having your own security detectives in place, having items that are most likely to be stolen away from the front door and in CCTV presence, you are always going to deter criminals, particularly if it's combined with a police response that is robust. So both Richard and I have been very keen over the last year to increase our focus on shoplifting, because it's not a low-level crime. These people are prolific, and it does have an impact on people like Michael's daughter and small businesses that are trying to make a profit. So I'd say we are focused in this area for the right reasons.
We get, especially in our roles, we often get the service failure when it's gone wrong or the relationships has failed. But I also know there will be some really great examples of partnership delivering the kind of outcomes that you've just referred to in West Mercia. How do you, as an organisation, balance that areas of where we need to do better through to this is the best practice and things that are going well? And I love an anecdote. Happened to be up in Sainsbury's in Telford last week. Popped in for a sandwich, as you do. As I was going through the front door, Sainsbury's staff coming out, there'd been a shoplifter detected by their undercover guard, leaving the site just as your colleagues were arriving on blue lights to intercept the vehicle. Person detained. That will never make our ears normally if I hadn't been in there popping in for my prawn sandwich of a lunchtime, but happened to chat to the staff in Sainsbury's, and they talked about the situation. They do get a good response when they call. There's always more to be done, but overall a fairly positive experience. But that isn't what crosses our desk, is it? Is when it goes wrong elsewhere. And how do you manage that balance between, yes, as Rich said, we're dealing with a spike, of course we are, but there is some really great examples of the partnership that you described.
Yeah, there is, and we need to make our organisation really proud of what they do, and people who live in West Mercia are proud of West Mercia Police. We perform well, but as you say, sometimes we don't. And my job is, when I see brilliant practice, or Richard's, to reinforce it, say thank you very much to our staff, keep working in that way, and where there has been a level of service that's not acceptable, to challenge it, and we can do that at a system level, but also at an individual level.
We can occasionally base our perception on outliers, can't we? And I agree that we sometimes see when things have gone wrong, and the public perception sometimes is based on those things that have gone wrong. Every day in West Mercia, there will be prompt responses to shoplifters who have been detained, to cases where a retail worker may have been subject to threats of violence. And I think it's really important that we target our resources in the most efficient and effective way. So I would expect, where a person has been detained for shoplifting, that we are there very promptly, certainly within an hour. And that would be a standing expectation I would envisage us meeting the great majority of the time. There will be occasions when a shoplifting occurs The store may perhaps only realise it afterwards by virtue of a stop check, and there's some CCTV of the offender. So then I would expect us to be efficient in terms of perhaps inviting the store to submit that to us electronically. We will identify, see if anyone knows who the person is. We will circulate it amongst all our officers and staff to try and identify the person, and then take action as necessary. So that may not elicit a physical response, but I'd like to try and get across that doesn't mean that something isn't being done. So we will deploy our resources really where the greatest benefit can be provided to the public and those people working in the retail sector.
Yeah, and it's worth emphasising to viewers, we are increasingly a tech-enabled organisation. So when you have good CCTV of someone, we do retrospective facial recognition, which is checked nationally against all images held in custody systems. So if you have CCTV of an offender doing something, we have a much higher chance now of being able to catch and identify them. So that's been a real boon for us over the last year as well.
So we're going to go on to talk about antisocial behaviour, a very broad issue that is far more complex than perhaps the name and indeed people's perception of it. In our stats, antisocial behaviour down nearly a quarter when we compare to last year, but still a big part of the concerns that are raised in this conversation and more generally in my engagement. I'm interested as to what the next 4 years might look like around antisocial behaviour. You've just started here some innovative work around hotspotting antisocial behaviour, and I'm just interested in a little bit about, as that starts to make an impact, what the effect will be and how that will change over the next 4 years. But just before you do that, I'm just going to quote Jonathan from Droitwich. Criminal damage, graffiti, theft, antisocial behaviour perceived as petty crime by the police, the lack of action taken by the police on such matters encourage perpetrators to continue and in some cases escalate their criminal activity, giving them the impression there is no accountability or consequences. So over the next 4 years, how do we change some of the, what might be right and might be wrong in some of what Jonathan says?
Yes, and Jonathan highlights a number of criminal offences there, graffiti, criminal damage, theft, and then antisocial behaviour, which is, as you describe, a little bit more subjective. And some people might see it at one extreme as being kids hanging out on a street corner, potentially nothing wrong with that, through to the harassment, alarm or distress that other people have experienced as a result of retail crime, people being abused or street drinking. And we have limited resources, so we have to focus where we can make the greatest impact. But we recognise the impact that antisocial behaviour has on communities. We all live in communities and we know it and experience it ourselves. And this is where, depending on what the crime type is, we focus the most appropriate police resource. Now, that might be, at one level, the services that you commission, supporting young people, Steer Clear campaign and other issues like that. It could be a PCSO challenging a youngster on the street, or it could be a neighbourhood police officer getting involved in arresting someone or doing some preventative work with them, right through to civil injunctions that we and our partners in local authorities can obtain around don't come into this town centre or don't be involved in this stalking or harassment. So I think we recognise it. We've recently relaunched our approach to ASB that's a lot more effective. When you call 101 around ASB, we have a more effective way of assessing its impact. But I think we, certainly Her Majesty's Inspectorate Constabulary, who inspect us, yourself, and any future government will be very much focused on ASB. And so I'd like to think we will be impacting on it.
I know from some of the casework that we've had and indeed some of the reporting in the press, graffiti in Droitwich, one of the instances resulted in the perpetrator cleaning up the graffiti and as it were. What's the balance between the weight of the law in terms of criminalising and that actually just the right thing happening? Because I don't know anything about the case other than what was reported in the public, but at the end of the day, the graffiti was cleaned up by the person who was purported to have done it. What's that balance between the strong arm of the law and supporting people's behaviours to change, do you think? And how do we progress that over the next 4 years?
That's an interesting point. And many of your viewers will have incredibly different opinions in relation to what they'd expect law enforcement to do in that space. So if I graffiti a wall and we asked your
Please
viewers,
don't.
we asked your viewers, what should we do? It would probably vary from put them in prison through to see if you can engage in a community resolution where you can get to the bottom of this and change the youngsters' behaviour. We in West Mercia Police and nationally want to be evidence-based. So what is the thing that is most likely to prevent that individual committing crime again? Now, if they're a seasoned offender, it might have to be prison. But if it's a young person, first offence, they're engaging with the police, they can speak with the victim, and we can work out between the victim and the offender, this is the best way to deal with this. Then in actual fact, that can be a beneficial outcome for everybody, where the victim gets justice, they can see that the offender is sorry and that they've done something about it, there's been some reparation, and the offence is brought to justice. We know who's done it, and it's cleared. So each case is sort of dealt with on its merits. We want to be quite child-centred in policing. We recognise, actually, the more kids you put in prison, they come out, they commit more crime. So if we can divert people from the criminal justice system when they're young, impressionable, and prevent them getting involved in a lifelong career of crime, then we will do that.
Claire Alex touched on the space that we also commission into in the traditional sense. Over this next 4 years, how do you think we build on potentially some of the things that we do already and the potential understanding either the gaps or where else we might want to go in this space?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things there. So we, as commissioners, we conduct needs assessments, which do a landscape review of existing service provision, identify areas of need, identify gaps in services. We've got a number of those that have recently been produced and are in the plan to be produced. And we'll very much be using those alongside our new police and crime plan as our evidence base for future commissioning of interventions. Some of the ones that we currently fund, as you touched upon earlier, around Steer Clear, for example, centred around young people at risk of getting involved in knife crime. We've also got services around young people that are involved in criminal exploitation or at risk of criminal exploitation. We work quite closely with the Youth Justice Service as well around some of their diversionary programs and also substance misuse programs as well for people that are particularly engaged in the Youth Justice Service. I'm interested in terms of the roles of your early help officers and how they can support and what the forces offer would look like over the next few years, specifically for children and young people as well. And I think there's definitely some scope for more partnership work and for us to work together to understand, as you say, the gaps in those services that we do commission.
Yes, and in the discussions coming up to the writing of your police and crime plan, one of the things that we said we'd like to focus on is how we can be more children-centred. We've got a good offer with our early help and intervention and prevention officers that all sit in either Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, Herefordshire or Worcestershire, identifying kids who are vulnerable for being involved in crime and then saying, okay, what's the best intervention, whether it's a commission services, a school intervention, or a charitable intervention that we can do with those children. And I think that's really good. And this is diverting people away from criminality. And we need to firm that up and continue its good work. And also, we've got those officers involved in schools, particularly secondary schools and increasingly PRUs, where the children need good engagement and interaction with policing, who can again offer diversionary pathways.
It will feature in different bits of the conversation, but I was going to raise it here. You touched on it earlier around what the public would want. What's your view as chief around the balance between criminal justice outcomes and an outcome? How over the next couple of years, how do you think we're going to progress the conclusion of an incident being a just outcome that isn't always something that involves in front of a magistrate or a judge?
I think my personal view is informed by the evidence, and there's been a number of studies, famous studies, one in London, one in Birmingham, called Turning Point, that demonstrates if you get a young person and you create an intervention with them compared to someone who's gone through a magistrate's court for a particular type of offences, particular type of ages and backgrounds, you can have a greater and more beneficial effect. So I think for young people, first offences, relatively low-key offences, a diversionary activity that still gets justice for the victim is the best thing for the community. Certainly not incarcerating those young people. It will change their life chances for the rest of their life. And I've certainly got friends and colleagues who will talk to me about how they got a criminal offence and it's affected all their prospects for the rest of their life. So obviously, if we're talking about serious offences like rape, serious sexual offences, burglary, serious acquisitive crime or organised crime, drug dealing, we're not in that space at all. But if we're talking about young people engaged in first offences, we will work with the victim to divert wherever possible, because I think that's the best for the community.
We talk a lot around justice and what that justice means being victim-led as well, in terms of how the victim supporting the outcome. And I think that's a really interesting balance as to how we also demonstrate the worth to some of those that have been victim to the issue of this is a just outcome for them. I'm particularly interested in how we develop our out-court disposals and the routes for other methods of disposing of the issue, holding people accountable for their behaviour, but also getting the right intervention. I think it's a really interesting time with the pressure on the criminal justice system, how we use that as an opportunity to make sure we are getting more just outcomes for more of our communities and those that are victim to other people's behaviours. So we're going to go on to talk about harm caused on our roads in West Mercia. West Mercia is a beautiful 3 counties in the heart of the country, but also has the most beautiful roads and people sometimes behaviour on them doesn't leads to the very worst happening in terms of being killed or seriously injured. It is the biggest causer of death in West Mercia. And indeed, we want to make sure that changes. Going to touch on some different areas around how in this next term we can see some progress towards the issue, because the central issue is about reducing the number, isn't it, that are killed and seriously injured. The first around technology. We live in a world where technology is part of our lives. Marcus, who's a community speedwatch volunteer in Shrewsbury, says, I feel something needs to be done to slow vehicles. Often during the later evenings and overnight, speeds are regularly in excess of 50 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. So how's technology going to play a part in this fight over the next 4 years? Mark's using an example, I don't know where he's referring to, other than it's in Shrewsbury somewhere, but it might be a spot that's unlikely to see a police officer doing some physical enforcement. What else is there available to help that tackling against somebody driving in excess of the posted speed limit?
Well, this is where the community are great in West Mercia, and I'm very grateful for Marcus for being a volunteer in a community speedwatch program. You know, him working with the police are keeping communities safer. And we, through funding from the OPCC, have been able to invest in some TrueCam cameras. And over the last year, over 1,500 people have been reported through the usage of TrueCam, where we can prosecute people. Neighbourhood teams can prosecute people when they take out that methodology. Obviously, speedwatch campaigns can catch people speeding, and then they come to us and we send letters out to the drivers to offer a level of deterrence. We also have a thing called SNAP that has been embraced in West Mercia, much more than I think in other forces, where citizens can send in imagery that they've caught of road offences, which we will, if we can, prosecute for. So that's also really helpful, and we're bringing a lot of people to justice in that way. We all use the beautiful roads here. I think only in the last week, on Monday, we reflected on everything that's gone over the weekend, some real tragedies. We'd had death on the roads here, you know, the impact that will have on children, families and lives. So it's incumbent that we and the community can do whatever we can to try and get those killed or seriously injured numbers down. And technology and volunteers in this way is one of the ways we can deal with it.
Our community have a diversity of views, of course, and different opinions. Dunk from Stourport in North Worcestershire said, stop obsessing with speed and focus on the quality of driving. Half the people sat at 40 in a 60 can't overtake properly, are spatially inept and are more dangerous. Now, I see, when West Mercia Police are out doing speed enforcement, there's all kinds of things from it must be short for the Christmas party, all the way through to we're just out revenue raising. How do you balance that element? Because it's very clear, isn't it, that shows that speed is one of the causes, inappropriate speed is one of the causes that contributes towards killed and seriously injured. But it's much wider than speed, isn't it, in terms of that wider skills that road users need to maintain. Over this next 4 years, how do you make sure, because speed will always be an element of it, but how do you make sure all the other bits around enforcement we need to focus on? Rich, I know you've seen some of this from some of your past roles. How do you think this will change over the next 4 years?
I think it's worth briefly revisiting why we take action on the roads. So far more people, I would expect, will transgress in terms of road safety legislation than they will in terms of some of the things we've been discussing already, such as theft and criminal damage. But the harm that can be caused by those transgressions is enormous. So Alex and I, during our careers, have responded to some awful tragedies. We've delivered news to people who had no idea we were there regarding the loss of a loved one, and speed and distraction contribute to those. So that's why we do it, and viewers will have different opinions on the legitimacy of that. I'd suggest that in the next 4 years, we will focus more on responding in a really targeted and intelligent way. So identifying through analysis the locations where serious collisions happen most frequently, which is something we do at the moment, then looking to install cameras or diversionary activity in those places, using technology as it develops to identify other forms of dangerous behaviour, such as the use of mobile phones whilst driving. And increasingly, there are some AI trials that are proving quite effective in that regard. So I would expect us always to focus on speed because it escalates the harm that can be caused by a collision, but also to focus on other forms of driver behaviour. And one of those things will be trying to ensure that we respond effectively when someone is on the road behaving dangerously, and it may be harder for us to find out who they are. So it's very straightforward. If let's say a law-abiding member of the public who has their car registered to them, who has insurance in their name, commits a speeding offence, for them to receive a ticket through the post. And on occasions that will be appropriate. But similarly, we may identify a vehicle that doesn't have a current registered keeper, that doesn't have current insurance, who is speeding. And so one of the things that we're very keen to ensure is that we develop a proper follow-up in those circumstances, perhaps using some of the technology available to us through really tenacious intelligence work, that those people don't get off scot-free. Because I would suggest that if they are not insuring their vehicle, if they're not registering their vehicle, if they're speeding, that they are more likely to cause harm on our roads than some of those people who have complied with the law but perhaps transgressed in terms of speed.
So the whole using that as the in to tackle the criminality and denying criminals use of the road network. I know we talk in around the 3 E's: enforcement, educational, and engineering. Enforcement got a place, been around for a very, very long time. Over the next 4 years, where would you like to see some progress around the other E's, the education and the engineering side?
So if I can come back to Dunk, I'd love him to meet some of my OPU officers who deal with death every day and talk to them about speeding. We call it the fatal four. So speeding, drugs and alcohol, seatbelts, and distraction, i.e. mobile phones. They're the killers on the road. That's why we concentrate on speeding. And a lot of that then is in the space of education that you've described. I often think about, has anyone driven in a bus lane? A lot of people will probably say yes. Have you driven in a bus lane without a seatbelt on? Probably not. Have you driven in a bus lane without a seatbelt on whilst on the phone? This is playing to Rich's point. You go from, like, the majority of people may have made a mistake, but when you aggregate them all up, you're beginning to look more like a criminal, and we need to intervene from a criminal point of view. But if you've got someone without a seatbelt on, speeding a little bit, there's actually a huge role to play in education. You've commissioned lots of services in this area. And often, whether you're on a motorbike or you're in a car, if you're caught speeding or if you're caught with a vehicle defect that we need to fix, we can divert you to a scheme which is more teachable rather than punishable. And so you don't get points on your license, but you do have to pay for the scheme, and the scheme pays for itself, therefore. Many police officers have been on speed awareness courses, and they're actually really good. You go in cynical, you come out, if you've been on one, and think, okay, that was very useful. And similarly, there's a thing called NRAC, which is if you're stopped on a motorbike, for example, we can refer you into a government scheme. It's run by the same organisation, which helps you assess risk better as a motorcyclist. And then I know there's other services to help people with alcohol addiction and driving. So really important that us working with partners, and then from your point around engineering, with the local authorities around how you design out the illegal use on the roads.
Claire, one of the areas that we've been talking about is around the opportunity for change. Alex just talked about a speed awareness course, if you, as an alternative to points, if you're eligible in terms of the speeding. Some of the other opportunities in terms of might not exist yet. If you might get a ticket for or get reported for an illegal number plate on your motorbike, whereas actually the intervention might be about needing to also A, they need to fix their number plate, but B, also uplift their skills. Over the next 4 years, what do you think is possible in terms of improving the offer to those communities whose behaviour perhaps isn't quite right at the moment, but needs that intervention to maybe adjust? Where are the areas do you think we can get some focus?
Yeah, so I think if I just talk briefly around our recent road safety grant round, £280,000 earlier on this year was offered out to local communities to bid for initiatives around road safety. Some of the ones that we funded in there are some road safety education initiatives in there, which look at driver and passenger education programs around car seat safety, as well as Pathfinder. I think what I touched upon earlier around our needs assessments. We've also had a road safety needs assessment highlighting some of the issues. Some of the areas, so in answer to your question, for us it's about continuously reviewing what our needs are, what are the profiles of the road offenders, are they motorbikes, are they cars, what charges are being brought, is it mobile phones, is it drugs, is it drinking? And I think it's really important for us to keep on top of that need and continuously review the services that we do commission. And some of the things that have been highlighted so far are around older drivers, for example. So our needs assessment has highlighted gaps in the kind of education programs which target older drivers. So that's something that we might look to do in the future. We've also had a recent report from West Mercia Police around motorcyclists. So we're reviewing that at the moment and working with partners to understand whether there is a need for commissioning services, specifically in relation to motorcyclists as well.
Really interesting, because I'm as commissioner, you won't be surprised to hear I am absolutely supportive around enforcement. Enforcement has a real role, but also that opportunity to also tap into somebody when they are willing to change their behaviour, how they're supported to do that. And I think that'll be really interested over this term as to how we give people more opportunities for people to change their behaviours. So we've been talking issues today around crime. Crime's featured a lot in the different parts of our conversation. But I wanted to focus on crime, on some explicit crime types that I think are in the concerns of our community. And the first one being around knife crime. Knife crime in West Mercia is relatively low, but is still an issue that gets lots of national attention. So therefore has lots of concern in some of our residents, and disproportionate concern in some of our sections of our residents. Susan from Longdon upon Tern in Shropshire said, we need to invest more in youth services and give young people alternative activities. How about creating a person's participatory budget where they can decide how the money is spent? Now, there's a bit of a rub, isn't there, between me starting this segment talking about crime, talking about it's a low issue, concerned about it, but Susan's comment is around how we're investing in alternatives. How do you marry that, or how are we going to continue to balance that between the crime underneath it, the perception, but also how we're preventing something that's already at a low level?
And the law, to a certain extent, does cater for this. Clearly, if you use a knife on somebody, you're probably going to go to prison. Particularly if you stab someone, you could threaten someone as well. These are serious offences where diversionary activity is more challenging. If, though, for example, you're found with a knife through a stop and search, and you've never been in trouble before, you will get arrested. But then that's the point where we say, okay, what diversionary activities can happen? We work with the Youth Justice Board, and as you know, referring to our last conversation, sometimes it could cause more harm if we criminalise someone unnecessarily, where we can divert them. So, working with the Youth Justice Board, we say, okay, what interventions are most appropriate for that individual? We're also worried about those people. You know, if you carry a knife, you're more likely to use it or have it used against you. So we need to safeguard and protect those people. So working with commission services, working with charities, and as we've already mentioned, steer clear, I think is really important. And it also demonstrates the importance of stop and search. You know, if you can take a knife off a street, it's an important thing to do, and we do engage in stop and search in West Mercia Police, but that doesn't mean that a child is criminalised. And then in the last few years, some of the big knives, like zombie knives that you've seen on the media, they were legal to have them in your home address now. And so people, if we did a search warrant and we found a zombie knife in a home address and it was prescribed by the law, we would be taking action, confiscating the knife, potentially arresting the individual. So it's not just stop and search. So it's important to get the message out there that you can't carry knives, you can't have these knives in your home. And if you do, A, you would get in trouble with the law, B, you might end up getting stabbed or being involved in a fracas. But to your point, Commissioner, we will work proportionately with the offender in any of these examples.
How does the perception issue? So we'll be talking about the next 4 years. Some of the feedback we had from some of the face-to-face engagement that we've done, and I think it was outside the Worcester Royal Hospital, where people were talking about young people with knives and teenagers in balaclavas. So I get the traditional view of, if somebody's got a knife or perceived to have a knife, there's an interaction or an intervention that you can do, can't you? Stop checking, taking the knife off them and the like. But wearing a balaclava is a fashion choice, isn't it? It'd be quite an interesting one at the moment with the hot weather that we're experiencing. But if some reason for a cultural, or some kind of social movement that somebody wants to wear a balaclava, it in most instances it is acceptable, as it were, but might be causing other people to be having concerns. So how do you balance, or how over the next 4 years are we going to try and balance some of this true need in terms of intervention around a knife through to people's perceptions around the impact of other people's way of life?
Well, I'll come to which in a bit, but I think you're right. You can wear a balaclava whenever you like, but we all live in these communities. Are you wearing a balaclava on a motorbike without a helmet, doing wheelies down the street? Then you're beginning road traffic offences, ASB. Are you on an electric bike going through a pedestrian area at 50 miles an hour with your balaclava on, again, causing danger? So these are points where you can, and the public would expect us to intervene, and I'd expect my staff to intervene as well. A balaclava on its own in the summer is what I would think a peculiar thing, but you're right, it's a fashion choice for someone, and they can wear it. But often I think where the public rightly get concerned is when you combine that with what you'd constitute criminal or significant antisocial behaviour, and then there's the expectation that we should intervene. I don't know if you have a view on that, Rich.
I agree. This is one of those areas where the perception created by a small number of dreadful incidents can affect a community's view very widely. So we don't think that there is an increase in knife crime in West Mercia. There isn't an increase in young people being admitted to hospital with sharp injury wounds, which is a good indicator of the reality. But a small number of young people, which is typically what we're talking about, carrying knives, can have a very significant impact. So again, it's something where we need to focus on the things that we can do, that only the police can do, because some of the causes for people wishing to carry knives may be very deep-seated in terms of upbringing, exposure to violence at a young age that perhaps are difficult for us to address, but some of them will be much more proximate. So those causes of knife carrying might be related to threats of violence because someone's become involved in drugs, someone's being exploited by someone in a criminal chain. And that's where I think we can get under the skin of these issues through really effective intelligence, through targeted use of stop and search, through sharing information with other agencies to try and divert people. But it's much more difficult for us to distract and divert people from knife carrying through universal patrol. So going back to the Bobby on the beat point, we need, for the purposes of mitigating the threat of knife crime, for example, to be in the right areas, targeting the right people at the right times, using that hotspot approach, rather than trying to be everywhere all of the time. So within finite resources, using our resources really effectively based on intelligence, understanding why someone may be carrying a knife and intervening at the earliest possible moment.
Might be worth just challenging some of the narratives out there on why people carry knives as well, because the one you hear quite often is, well, they carry knives because they're scared, or in case you need one to defend yourself. And there's been some work on it that says really there's three reasons. One is fear, one is utility, i.e. you want to use it on somebody, and the other one is credibility, like, look at me, I'm cool. And when we see some of the knives nationally, and less so in West Mercia, when they are whopping great machetes or hunting knives, that's not someone who's scared. That's either credibility or they want to use it. So in the same way, our shoplifting isn't increasing because people are stealing nappies to care for their children. We know that. In the same way, I'd like to counter the narrative that says children are carrying knives because they feel scared. When you see the knives that are seized nationally and rarely in West Mercia, they are the big knives that cause those sort of signal crime issues in the media, where you see someone with a machete in the street. Everyone is a bit shocked, and they're the ones we need to come down hard on.
So young people involved here in some of this issue. We police with all of our community. How do you think we can ensure the voices of young people are also heard in not only this debate but the wider debate on the laws of our land and how they're enforced? Claire, you obviously run some of the commissioning for me, and perhaps we'll touch in a moment around the wider preventative work, but just firstly around how young people's voices can be heard and how we can improve that.
Yeah, so I'm interested in terms of, so as part of our needs assessments, we always have an element of consultation and engagement activity in there. So that's normally our method for building the evidence base. We have engaged with children and young people for our child sexual exploitation needs assessment. We've got a child criminal exploitation one at the moment. And again, we are continuing to bring the young person's voice in there. I'm interested in how we can link up with the force around the work that you're doing around the children, young person's voice that you touched upon earlier.
Yeah, we as a force have invested a lot. Youth engagement officers, school liaison officers, PCSOs who are out speaking with young people all the time, probably in the most important way possible. So sometimes we say, well, where's our youth parliament? But in actual fact, us going to meet children where they are in the places where they speak and engage is really useful for us. How we use their voice in policy creation is interesting as well. And as you know, we have stop and search scrutiny panels where members of the public come in and watch us stop and search people with the body-worn video. There are perhaps other areas over the next 4 years we can look at hearing young people's voices more corporately across West Mercia.
Drugs is another area raised around the crime in our communities, and it gets fed back a lot around the perceived open nature of that drug taking, drug dealing. Alan from Ledbury said drug dealing is taking place in Ledbury. I hope whatever level of drug dealing / use exists, here is a priority for the law, especially as it feeds other crime. So drugs are in our society, and the abuse of illegal drugs is around. What more over the next 4 years, and how do you think the tackling of something that's embedded in our society will progress, and what West Mercia Police's role in that will be?
So this is a really interesting question, and going back to the Bobby on the beat question, the Bobby on the beat can deal with some level of drug use in a public space. Someone smoking cannabis or someone street dealing definitely. But the suppliers above that, a Bobby on the beat, won't be equipped to deal with that. And that's where we need to invest in our serious organised criminal departments and our detectives who do that. And we have specialist drug officers, and I'll ask Richard to speak in a bit around the success of some of those operations. And as the questioner rightly highlights, if you are dealing drugs, you're more likely to carry a weapon, a firearm, more likely to engage in violence. And certainly some of the drug networks that we've intervened with, even in the last few weeks, we've recovered firearms off the streets of West Mercia. So again, not something a Bobby on the beat would have done, but something that a detective embedded in the community can achieve. And I think at a tactical level, our focus therefore will continue to be on drugs, particularly if a drug network is involved in violence. And then there's the much wider scheme of how we work in partnership to deal with some of the emerging issues. The drugs boards that you chair, Commissioner, I'm concerned around the increasing use of synthetic opioids or drugs like monkey dust we've seen in Telford that can be incredibly damaging to individuals as well as causing antisocial behaviour. So no one is, I don't think, blind to what's gone on in San Francisco and some of the synthetic opioid issues beginning to emerge in Scotland. To what extent can it emerge here? We need to be prepared for that and to be on top of that as well. I mean, before we move on to some of the drug board stuff, I don't know, Rich, if you want to come in on some of the interventions that have been made.
There's really effective intervention work going on every day across the force area in respect of drugs, from drug testing of people on arrest in custody to ensure that they're subject to appropriate diversion, to intelligence building against a number of county lines gangs who are causing misery within towns across West Mercia. And that activity may not always be visible all of the time, because frequently we need to build up a mass of evidence regarding people's mobile telephone use and other means of evidence to build a proper picture before we take action. We've had some real success recently in Shrewsbury in the last few weeks, with a number of people being arrested as a result of a long-running operation to try and gather evidence of drug use that was directly affecting antisocial behaviour and theft in the town centre. Similarly, recently within Worcester, a number of criminal gangs and county lines gangs have been targeted, and that is happening all of the time across the force area. It's one of those things where, to revisit Alex's point, it's a very visible activity sometimes affecting the communities of the force, but we need to really identify who's behind it. Going back to taking a children-centred approach, sometimes those dealing are being exploited themselves. And so building up an understanding through intelligence and investigative work of where our efforts are best placed is really important.
We've touched a little bit around theft, but if I just draw theft and burglary together, burglary particularly, a really impressive over time story around the level of burglary. Burglary is far rarer now than it was a decade ago, 2 decades ago. Real quite impressive, yet still something that gets raised regularly in terms of causes concern. I know from family members or other members of the community who've reported to me about the impact of them on burglary, the impact of it. How do we continue to make sure that burglary levels go down over the next 4 years? Because you've already made some significant progress. How will the next 4 years manifest that continued reduction?
Yeah, this is a challenge, and we've been speaking over the last weeks. This year, since April, we've seen a sizable reduction in burglaries, a really significant reduction, and that's on top of the reductions from last year, with more offenders being brought to justice, but not enough. And like we spoke about with KSIs, the impact of a burglary on a family home, on an individual, is significant. So it's right that we get a great level of service. And I'm confident that for the conventional domestic burglary, you do get a good level of service, and that we respond quickly, and that forensics are offered, and that we investigate as thoroughly as possible. I'm concerned, if we look at how burglary has changed a lot, with plenty of exceptions. Back in the day, building on our last point, much of it was drug-induced. And the idea of someone walking down the street with a video recorder, if you remember those, feeding a Class A drug habit, Now we have what we call car key breaks, where particularly in some areas of the force, high value vehicles are stolen and the keys for those vehicles are stolen. That's not to do with drugs, that's about money. It's a hard crime to investigate. We work very closely with West Mercia Police, and I suggest over the next 4 years, some of our focus in that organised burglary space will be equally important.
Because that the impact of West Midlands Police right on our doorsteps on some of our big borders is can be quite impactful. Some of the feedback we've had, quoting John from Newport, police attendance at each and every instance of domestic burglary, and then Dunk from Stourport, stop invasive crime, particularly burglary. All I have to show for my burglary is an increased insurance premium and the cost of replacing my gate and locks. The force already got a long-standing commitment to attend every domestic burglary. How does it's a decreasing number of incidents? How are you also going? How do you think we can improve the satisfaction of those that end up being victim of this crime?
So I'll bring in the DEP here because he looks at it on a monthly level and holds our own staff to account for both attendance, satisfaction and detection.
If someone's home is broken into, they will get a physical attendance from West Mercia Police. And it's hard for us to absolutely track the data on that. But when I last looked at it and we checked, officer, you haven't said you've been to this, but can we make sure you have? They've said yes, and we can establish that they have been. Then the compliance for the month that we looked at was about 97%. And there'll be nuances, without boring people, of what we have to record as crimes that probably explain the other 3%. So when someone's home is broken into, there will be a response from an officer, and in the great majority of cases from a crime scene investigator as well. And the crime scene investigator may come first, depending on the urgency of preserving that forensic material. We can't make the same guarantee in respect of outbuildings, for example, but what I do expect is that an individual assessment will be made of what's the impact on the victim of that perhaps shed or garage being broken into, what's the loss, and we will make a judgment as to the value in terms of what investigative leads exist for us to follow up. But to be clear, if someone's home is broken into, they should and will get attendance from a police officer.
In my engagement around this big conversation and over the last 8 years, the voice of the rural communities raising their concerns has been pretty consistent. And there's no such thing as rural crime, is there? It just is crime that is happening out there in our rural communities, and some of it being environmental crime. Debbie from Pembridge said rural crime needs a better presence by West Mercia Police, i.e. thefts from garden outbuildings, theft of farm vehicles, off-road trespassing. Paul from Kidderminster, top of my list would be crimes against the environment, illegal discharges into rivers and waterways, industrial pollution, fly tipping and other crimes which degrade the environment and agricultural land. Some interesting mix of issues there, some that I know are matters for the police and some that are matters for other agencies. Over this next 4 years, how do you think we can build some of the confidence in our rural communities that they are getting the right level of service?
So I like your point where you said it's sort of not rural crime, it's just crime. And we need, as if there is a different class of crime. When I think about if I was a farmer and I have my machinery stolen, often quad bikes, sometimes high-powered tractors, this is serious, organised, acquisitive crime that we must be passionate about disrupting. And we have Operation Cordon recently has dealt with organised crime groups who were focusing on this area and targeting rural communities to steal things like quad bikes. And we've managed to eliminate the threat from organised crime groups associated with that. It's really important. And it's difficult as well because we are such a large force. Herefordshire and Shropshire are big areas, and some parts of Worcestershire. So CCTV is not ubiquitous, and we have to rely on other areas of investigation. So I think that's really important for us. And I also share Paul's passion for environmental crime, accepting that we should work in partnership with the environmental community. And in fact, as you know, one of our ACCs, Rachel Jones, has been dealing with, in a goal group, with a very big incident of this environmental damage. And right through to cruelty to animals, whether that's hare coursing, and we've dealt with a very high profile case in Worcestershire in relation to the torture of monkeys, believe it or not, recently. So these are all areas that are really important to us. And I think we've got rural crime officers, and we will be focusing on it in the next 4 years.
So relationship is sometimes the centre of building trust. We talked earlier around visibility and accessibility, but just more explicitly around rural communities, because some of them are quite far apart. Some of them are quite sparse in terms of density of population. Over this next 4 years, is there an aspiration, or how can we improve some of that? Being physically present more, but also being more accessible over these next 4 years.
Well, there's changes we've made even in the last few months. So in probably our area that is sparsest with the biggest geography is Shropshire. And Shropshire have historically, therefore, had the slowest response times because they've got the greater geography to carry on. So we have pushed more officers into Shropshire to be able to respond quicker to areas which are slightly more isolated. But our focus over the next 4 years on getting extra capacity into community areas is really important. Our volunteer community is really important, and we've got farm watches and street watches that are hugely impactful, I think. And as well as dealing with the organised crime groups that the questioner refers to here, I think they're all areas that we should concentrate on. We also have our rural crime officers who spend long time, as you say, target hardening, but getting out with smart water. And I've been out with them speaking to farmers and watching them do their work, and it's hugely welcome. And it just offers that extra reassurance that we are out there. I don't know if Richard's anything you want to add in this?
It's undeniably difficult, and I can't dress it up any other way for the same reasons that we talked about, focusing on town centre teams as high concentration areas for antisocial behaviour and crime, and our ability to have a really big impact. Crime affecting rural communities isn't high in concentration. So vast areas with crime committed across those areas makes it very difficult for us to prevent it by way of patrol activity, for example. But what we can do is try and develop an understanding of who the offenders are most likely to be and target the offenders perhaps in a more productive way than targeting the locations, which for the reasons I've given is really difficult. I think the greatest step we can take is ensuring that when someone is targeted, and it may be theft of plant, for example, or theft of and a crime affecting livestock, that is given the seriousness that it deserves. So ensuring that there's a really effective investigative response where we demonstrate that we do take it seriously, that we take relevant details, that we ensure we've got all the details of the stolen property, that we support people in terms of identifying where that property might be. So this is something that is hard in terms of preventative work based on patrol, but we can be smart about targeting offenders, ensuring that property is followed up. But it would be entirely dishonest of me to say that this is something that we can patrol our way out of. But that is entirely different from saying that this is something that is really significant in its impact, and people deserve to have a significant response when it occurs.
So I want to move on to talk about response to crime and its impact on confidence in our community. I think most people would absolutely expect that when they pick up the phone to report a crime or report it online, either in an emergency or not, that they would expect a quality, proportionate service in response to it. Couple of comments from some residents in Stourport. Ingrid from Stourport: every crime report call responded to appropriately. Far too frequently, victims are left without a response. Jennifer, also from Stourport: are reports being followed up by local police? Because I personally think not, which is a bad and sad thing. and Andrew from Redditch, to be honest with you, as a victim, I've lost confidence in West Mercia Police as a force to keep our residents safe. Now, 3 anecdotes which are not positive, and yet there will be thousands of positive victim experiences, won't there, that will have happened in the same time that we've been collating for this session. As we move through this next 4 years, I'm interested in how we can use technology better, how we can provide a more consistent level of service to those calling West Mercia Police for help. And sometimes I think as well that is about that there is no service, i.e. engaging with the organisation about something that the force can't necessarily either respond to, or there is a proportionate response that might not be in line with the community's expectations and how those are managed. But how we improve the experience of those engaging with the organisation, looking for service.
Yes, and if there's some reassurance I can give to Ingrid or Jennifer or others, Andrew, we spend a long time looking at all the crime that has been reported and saying, have we done an appropriate investigation here? A huge amount of audit takes place, which we assure ourselves that it has or has not been dealt with effectively. And then subsequently, we're inspected on that as well. It's a key priority for our inspectorate. We also listen to calls for service to say, have we treated this member of the public with the dignity that they deserve? And recently, an independent inspection across 100 calls showed that we were being empathetic and understanding across all those calls. But you rightly highlight that where some people may expect an attendance, but we don't have enough staff to attend, that we will say, okay, in this instant, we might deal with it over video, we might deal with it over the telephone, and we'll do all reasonable lines of inquiry, potentially without attending the job. Now, some members of the public might understand that and accept that, and others might think that's not acceptable. The other thing, we need to be victim-centred. So if someone says, this has happened, but in actual fact, we think they're vulnerable, we think there might be a threat to that individual, then of course we would respond.
How does this change though? I think we've done quite a lot, and indeed we've done quite a lot of holding to account around the front door. And we are currently where we are, and I think we understand some of the plans. But over this next term, over this next 4 years, how are we going to improve the chances that you are likely to get a level of service that you would recognise as being good or acceptable from West Mercia Police?
So there's already quite a lot of change ahead. You've spoken about technological change. We're bringing lots of new technology into our call centres that mean we can deal with the calls more appropriately. And then our focus, our internal focus, is we're a people-led, tech-enabled crime-fighting organisation. So again, viewers need to understand we are here to deal with crime, and we will respond as effectively as we can. And certainly my ambition, the ambition of the DEP, is to continually improve that. So more justice for victims, a better satisfaction rate, and demonstrably more reasonable lines of inquiry have taken place for all the crimes that have been reported. Similarly, I mean, implicit in this is the response. So we also look at response times. Where do we deploy our officers whilst they're waiting for a call so that they can maximise their speed of attendance is also key.
I just think it's worth pointing out that we always want to solve more crime. Alex and I will be entirely symptomatic of all officers in the force that we're here doing what we do because the thought of people getting away with breaking the law, particularly when it affects a victim, upsets us, disturbs us, and we want to do something about it. We are solving more crime this year than last year. We solved more crime last year than the year before, and I entirely appreciate the experience of those who've responded to this exercise, that there will be individual instances where not all reasonable lines of inquiry are followed up. And that's the test that we would want to apply. Have we identified all reasonable lines of inquiry for this crime? Have they been followed up? In a growing number of cases, that is happening, and that's being reflected in more offenders being brought to justice, more people being charged with offences, and victims getting a greater sense of justice being served. So
I want to talk about an area of society that doesn't always get a lot of the coverage around the more vulnerability-based exploitative harm, crime being caused around domestic abuse, sexual violence, child criminal exploitation, child sexual exploitation, modern slavery, human trafficking. Lots of areas that we want to describe the offending around, but ultimately all of those behaviours are somebody exploiting somebody else, either through physical harm, mental harm. Some of that caused within the setting of a relationship, or a domestic setting. Some of that caused in other settings. It's a big part of our volume as well in terms of all of the, I think the crime incidents, nearly 30% has a links to domestic abuse. So epidemic, some might describe, levels volume-wise. I can recognise the progress we've made as a society over the last 8 years. I'm interested in the next 4 years. Aspirationally, what are the things do you think we would want to look back in 4 years' time and say this is the things that we've seen moving forward?
Thanks. Well, I'm really pleased you raised this. And often when you speak to members of the public, these don't come up as often as you would think. So burglary is commonly mentioned, antisocial behaviour and speeding. But I do think when you talk about child sexual exploitation, domestic abuse, of course, people watching this will be thinking, yeah, of course, you must do that as well. And this is something that sometimes Bobbies on the beat as well are not the best police officers to do. You need specialists in child sexual exploitation, specialists in domestic abuse. And these have the most profound effect for generations if you don't deal with it correctly. You know, a child who grows up in a family where there's domestic abuse, it will affect their outcomes for a long period of time. I had a senior officer in my office yesterday, passionate about domestic abuse, and she describes going to domestic abuse incidents, seeing 12-year-olds at DA incidents, and she can say that was me when I was 12. And she said, I was there pleading for the police officer to do something, and then the police officer left. And as a result of that, she joined the police to do something about domestic abuse, and is really keen in saying, how do we maximise the impact we have when we attend incidents of domestic abuse? And here we've, in West Mercia, we've had the most terrible murder of Alfie Steele, haven't we? So you asked, Commissioner, in 4 years, where are we going to be? Well, I would want to be reassured in 4 years' time that we respond effectively to all these incidents quickly with a partnership approach, with the correct risk assessment and with the ability to intervene. So I have an officer who goes, not only deals with the domestic abuse or the vulnerability in front of them, thinks wider about the siblings, the children, look in the fridge for food, is the bedding adequate, making an appropriate risk assessment, being passionate about referring the DA victim to services and the DA offender to offender programs, working with the CPS to see if we can prosecute, looking at civil interventions like DVPNs in all the cases as much as possible. Through to the exploitation that Richard referred to of children to deal drugs, for example, that's in this space as well. And perhaps one of the, we speak about human trafficking, but and I know you're very keen on like the voice of the marginalised and who are the silent people in communities. And we in West Mercia have a lot of silent communities, which we're really keen to engage with and protect. And this is something we're moving into this year. The in-private sex work industry in West Mercia is very big, as it is everywhere. And there's a huge amount of vulnerability there. And over the next coming months, we'll be able to demonstrate that we're beginning to intervene in that space as well.
We, as a society, and policing no different, we are moving on from some of the victim blaming language that we've seen in our history around the role of the victim to be less vulnerable, etc. But more about we don't need to keep the victim safer, we need to stop the perpetrator perpetrating. We're very lucky in West Mercia. We've got, for the first time, all risk level domestic abuse perpetrator programs. Claire, do you just want to touch on what the aspirations are over the next 4 years in terms of in this preventative work, because I think it's taken for as absolute as read that we will continue to drive and develop our support services for all of the crime types that we've been talking about here. That's non-negotiable. But what about in the relation to the stopping the offender either repeat offending or offending in the first place? What do you think the aspiration is over the next 4 years?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different aspirations really. If I take children and young people as an example, we currently fund West Mercia Women's Aid for Children and Young Persons project, who work with children of families where domestic abuse is present. We are looking to enhance that provision using some serious violence duty funding moving forward. I think there's also a need for us to work with in greater partnership with other organisations such as local authority children's services, for example, to really enhance that children and young persons provision. We've also got, as you mentioned earlier, services to support victims of domestic abuse. We are anticipating further funding from the Ministry of Justice next year for those services. And where we can, we will look to grow those services. Demand is not decreasing, unsurprisingly. They are delivering really, really effective work. So we'd like to see those continued and bolstered where we can. And if I think about the perpetrators, yes, you touched upon the all risk perpetrator program. So we have a variety of programs in West Mercia now. We started off very much in the in terms of prevention in the tertiary prevention space with Drive, working with the high risk, high harm perpetrators. We've then moved more into the secondary prevention area, where we are working with perpetrators where the risk has been assessed as medium or even standard. And more recently, we're about to launch our third programme around those, I say low level, but it's low level in the context of potentially first time offenders where there isn't a history of that kind of behaviour. So we'd really like to see the impact of that programme, and again, potentially look to expand that should we start to see some good results. So yeah.
I'm really proud of the work in West Mercia of developing our offer in terms of prevention, and particularly around perpetrating behaviour. All of it requires the perpetrator to want to engage to do it, and none of it ever lets anybody off a punishment element if there is a requirement for to be held accountable for the behaviour through the criminal justice system. That also is present, but this is another opportunity offered. I'm particularly also pleased to see some of the work around positive masculinity and the role, because the sad fact remains that the vast majority of perpetrators are male, the vast majority of victims of these areas that we've been talking about are female. And that doesn't mean that there aren't female perpetrators, and that doesn't mean that there aren't male victims. Of course there are. And I would also suggest there is underreporting in those two categories that I've just alluded to. So therefore that investment in the positive view of what masculinity can be and should be, I think, really, really important.
I think one of the other things as well is that we'd like to see continue. As part of the setup of Drive, we set up multi-agency domestic abuse perpetrator panels. So those panels have a range of different partners, and whilst primarily it's to assess the levels of risk and to put in place interventions to disrupt that perpetrator behaviour, we've got some really interesting views around how interventions can be delivered. So if I think of a previous example, John, you mentioned that for the Drive programme, yes, you do need to engage, perpetrators do need to engage, that's the benefit, and one of the benefits is that they can engage in that behavioural change work. But where they don't want to engage in that behavioural change work, there is an element of disruption activity that will be undertaken, and that could be something as simple as picking them up for a driving offence. that it's really quite innovative, and that's why it's really important that we get the right partners around the table for those kind of discussions, so that that disruption activity can continue even where there isn't the commitment to engage with the behaviour change work.
So as we draw our big conversation session to a close, Alex, I just wondered if you just wanted to offer some observations about this next 4 years in terms of the areas that you think should be included in focus, and maybe some of the aspirations that you would want to see for that the community would recognise in terms of the development of West Mercia Police and its role in our community.
It's an exciting time the next 4 years. Of course, there'll be constraints with new government and opportunities, but I think you can be reassured that the leadership of West Mercia Police is focused on crime fighting, focused on protecting victims and getting justice for victims. And that means investing in some technology. It means delivering a brilliant level of service. And it also means supporting my staff, but also supporting the community to work in this space. We 100% believe in prevention. We think there's some things that the police can help prevent, and we think there's other things that the police are not very good at. And that's when we come to you around commissioning and some of our partners. And perhaps that's the other area to focus on. We're really keen with our local authority partners, with NGOs like Women's Aid, and with schools to work across the system to say, how can we better meet the needs of the community from a criminal justice point of view? Because, of course, that is a significant challenge that across the country the public are aware of as well.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of those that submitted questions and comments and observations into the preparing for this session. As Police and Crime Commissioner, I'm very clear that I'm the voice of the public in policing, and making sure that we can hear those views that help influence the policy document that a police and crime would be, but also the work that I do, not only commissioning an efficient and effective police force, but also holding the Chief Constable to account. Your views matter, and today's session is another part of demonstrating of how we use the views of the public to help help ensure that the services that we deliver are in line with those community wishes and need. For more information, do please keep an eye on my website. If you put West Mercia PCC into your search engine, or onto our social media channels on Facebook and X and Instagram for further opportunities as to how to get involved.